Hi everyone, Eric here. Before we get to our discussion today with Jakkie Cilliers from the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria about his new book, Africa First, I want to make sure you know about our daily China-Africa newsletter. Now, more than ever, we all need accurate, high-quality information about what's going on with COVID-19 and how it's impacting Africa and China's engagement there. And that's what we're doing every single day with this newsletter, by filtering out the noise and giving you a daily digest of just the information you need to know. Find out more and subscribe today at chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. It's half off for students and faculty. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, these are exceptional times, and if you told me a month ago even that African leaders would now be basically going to the G20, going to the international community and asking for a full debt forgiveness and a write-off of the debt, I wouldn't have believed it, because we were still in this idea that African economies are growing. It was still part of the Africa Rising narrative. Although it was running into some problems, there was still a lot of optimism about the future. Now here we are amidst the COVID-19 crisis, and it is very, very scary. Let me just give you a little bit of a quote from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed from Ethiopia, who wrote an open letter to the G20. And he said that fragile and vulnerable at the best of times, African economies are staring at an abyss. Those are dramatic words as to where we are, and inconceivable that at the beginning of the year we would be here today.
Yes, it's crazy. And it raises so many questions about how things are going to develop. You know, in a lot of ways, mapping futures at the moment is a really tough thing to do. Because everything is kind of up in the air, and one of the big issues raised by his appeal is, what is China going to do? Obviously, China is a G20 member, but China is also a massive holder of bilateral debt in Africa. So it raises a lot of questions about how China will act, and then what the impact will be on Africa.
So when we think about debt back in the 90s, and when I'm talking about the old days, debt usually was held by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and maybe some of the big powers in Europe and the United States. Today, when we look at debt, 2/3 of Africa's debt is owned by either bilateral lenders, namely the Chinese, who own about 20% of all of Africa's bilateral debt, and private lenders, that's the Eurobond holders. So negotiating debt relief is going to be much more difficult today than it was back in the old days, which is why I was on Twitter a lot of the day today, really wondering out loud why people like President Macky Sall in Senegal and Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia are directing so much of their attention towards the G20, the World Bank, and the IMF, when in fact they should be talking to Fitch, Moody's, and Xi Jinping. Just because the world has changed so much. So we're going to get a little bit of a taste of what we can think about going forward in the future, in part because there is a wonderful new book that just came out. The timing is absolutely exquisite, called Africa First, written by Jakkie Cilliers. And if you are familiar with African think tanks and analysis, you will know who Jakkie is. He is the founder of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, Africa's largest independent institute focused on security issues. Today, he's the chair of the ISS Board of Trustees and head of the African Futures and Innovation Program at ISS. And we're thrilled to have you on the show. Very good afternoon to you, Jakkie.
Thank you for having me. I'm a great listener to your program, and I really enjoy your podcasts.
Well, thank you. And we're honored to have you on our program, and really at this incredible time where your book is coming out, looking at the future of Africa. And I'd like to get your take about when you wrote a book about Africa First, and it was looking forward, and you are a futurist and looking at where Africa is going. When you see what's happening today and the crisis that so many African countries find themselves in, a crisis that nobody could have foreseen, that at the same time, demand for African commodities just evaporated. Supply of goods from places like China disappeared. Debt payments are just skyrocketing because interest rates on Eurobonds are going up and capital is just drying up. This is something none of us could have foreseen. How much of what's going on today challenges the premise of what you wrote in your book, Africa First?
Well, one of the advantages of looking long-term is that it's much easier to look long-term structural than it is short-term. And the coronavirus is certainly going to have a huge impact on Africa. I think generally the consensus is a larger impact than the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And if you look at graphs and look at forecasts, you can clearly see the impact of that, the global financial crisis, but you also see the recovery. So Africa First takes a long-term view on the future of Africa. I look out till 2040. And when you look long-term and you deal with structural drivers like population and productivity structures of your economy, then these crises have a severe impact, but over time, the trends return to the mean. And that's more or less, I think, what we will see. We will see demand for commodities, for example, resurge again, probably this time driven by India rather than by China. Although India's growth, and India is the next big thing globally, is less commodity dependent than China's was. And you will see African economies continuing to transition. At the moment, as we all know, Africa is becoming more commodity dependent than the reverse. So the transition that we would like to see of African economies becoming more diversified is not happening. But on the other side, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the ability of Africa to leapfrog, etc., these do provide opportunities that will resurface. I think what I find interesting is what is the impact of the virus going to be on our ability to work remotely, and in actual fact to force a sense of leapfrogging that otherwise we would not have had. My institute, or the institute that I work at the ISS, we all, like everybody else in South Africa, we're in lockdown. So we are forced to work from home and to explore new ways of collaborating with partners, of spreading our message. And these transitions are going to, I think, accelerate what we generally refer to as the digital economy, the fourth industrial revolution, whichever term you would like to use. So yes, there are downsides, and certainly the risks are not, the situation at the moment is not looking good for the next year, possibly for Africa, but the structural drivers will reestablish themselves.
You mentioned that Africa is becoming more commodity dependent rather than less. Why is that the trend? And then also, do you foresee that the crisis might kick off, might force some diversification on the ground?
Well, within the forecasting community, it's actually been for the last 10, 20 years, it's been that the next crisis is going to be a global pandemic. In actual fact, there's a widely renowned podcast, a TED Talk that Bill Gates gives, where he actually says he has got this picture of showing the next big threat is not a global thermonuclear threat, but it looks like this. And then he shows a picture which everybody today recognizes as the picture of the virus. And so on the one side, these trends are from a structural long-term point of view, it's happened, and we're all surprised at the speed and the rapidity that it's happened. But it's in actual fact been on the radar for a decade or two. But what has not happened is that none of us have prepared for it. So in that video that I'm referring to, Bill Gates makes the point that billions of dollars, trillions have been thrown at preventing thermonuclear war, but nothing has been done on the issue of virus protection or a global pandemic, despite the fact that we all know this is most likely the next big global threat to, I would almost say, next to climate change that could really threaten humanity. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent there. So, Corbus, maybe just remind me where you want us to go.
Well, kind of the basic issue of why Africa remains so stuck in a commodity economy. Kind of why even now, as everyone in Africa keeps talking about the need to diversify, they're actually moving in the opposite direction to become even more commodity dependent. And do you foresee that the kind of shock of the crisis might force a diversification?
I think the crisis will force a degree of diversification because the demand for the commodity, certainly in the short to medium term, is going to fall off. But structurally, remember what I've said, if we look at a long term, the expectation and the forecast in Africa first is also that the next great commodity boom is going to come from India from around 2028 onwards, and that will certainly contribute to giving a next boost to the African economy, because the commodity cycle, as we all know, structurally goes, like all cycles, has its peaks and troughs. So I do expect that over time, a next large commodity boom is going to benefit Africa. The challenge is that African countries did not use the last commodity boom that came from China to really invest in the diversification. And there are two reasons for that. The one, and the obvious one, is the absence of clear directed leadership. We find countries where you see that level of leadership. Rwanda, Ethiopia obviously comes to mind. You see a determined effort to diversify their economies. But that diversification comes with a degree of pain. And the second opportunity for Africa's diversification will be provided by the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But also in the implementation of the free trade area, the challenge is that are African leaders, particularly those that are elected, prepared to accept the short-term pain, the loss of tariff income that would allow for a regional integration? Because the way I look at Africa, without a sufficient degree of trade integration, we certainly cannot unlock large enough markets to be able to grow African economies. And if you want to go up the value-added curve, you need markets. You need national and regional value chains. You need to trade with other countries in the region, because that allows you to increase your value-added component of your trade, and eventually allows you to participate in global value chains, although these are changing. And one of the ways, as you have discussed in your program very often, that is that the world trade is changing, is that it's becoming more regional. And manufacturing is, in a sense, becoming, I wouldn't say decentralized, but it's moving closer to real-time manufacturing that is orientated more towards the market and the opportunities in the market than it is to where the cheapest labor or manufacturing opportunities may lie. So this structural change in global economies, I think, is to Africa's benefit. Some refer to it in the book. Some refer to it as the sort of Alibaba model of manufacturing. But certainly, the way in which energy and technology is allowing a more distributed kind of a cottage type of manufacturing does hold certain opportunities for Africa, limited, because as we all know, Asia has become the world's manufacturing hub, and that's where everything is made. But certainly it offers Africa certain benefits, but it's going to require a degree of pain to move from the easy reliance upon commodity exports towards economies that are more diversified and that goes up that value-added chain.
Last week, I was invited on CNBC Africa to talk about this very issue, and the presenter asked me the question of saying, well, is the COVID-19 crisis an opportunity for Africa then to start trading with itself rather than to depend on China for so much of its imports? What we're seeing right now is obviously the cutoff in trade from China has exposed the B2B market, so the intermediate goods, that the chemicals, cement, things that businesses use for construction and for all the other things, that's gone away. Consumers are suffering now because they can't buy products that they're used to buying in all of the various shops that come from China. Food is suffering, so rice and fish are imported from China. So a lot of people are seeing this as an opportunity for Africa to now fill that void itself. I come out quite bearish on this. And I live in Southeast Asia, where I see how difficult it's been over the past 20 years for Southeast Asian economies to do it. and they're light years ahead of where most of Africa is. So when we talk about transitioning to a manufacturing economy, you need consistent power, something you in South Africa don't even have. Most of the continent still has to suffer with brownouts. There isn't enough power for industry and for consumers. You need logistics. You need supply chain networks, infrastructure. The infrastructure gap is still at about $100 billion a year, $1 trillion over 10 years. Where is all this going to come from in the short term in order to build this manufacturing dream that so many people want to happen? But at the end of the day, it just doesn't look like Africa and most African countries are ready for it.
No, you're largely, I would largely agree with the analysis that you're putting out. What Africa First does is I model 11 transitions that have to occur in Africa that over time will start reducing the growing gap between, for example, average levels of income in Africa and in the rest of the world. The book has its origins in a single graph, which is a graph of growing divergence between the average GDP per capita in Africa since independence in the 1960s, and includes a forecast to 2040. And you see how Africa's average incomes in Africa are falling further and further behind the averages in the rest of the world. So the question that I ask in Africa First is, what needs to happen to change that trajectory? And that trajectory of growing divergence, where things are improving in Africa but more slowly than anywhere else in the world, can only be changed with a combination, an entire transition of Africa, where Africa advances its demographic dividend. It really experiences an agricultural revolution. It enters low-end manufacturing. It becomes, governance improves. It becomes more stable. We look at the rollout of basic infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So these 11 transitions in total, if you take them all together, over time, means that Africa starts closing the growing gap between itself and the rest of the world. So these are long-term structural transitions, and what Africa First does, it presents, I think, in a structured way, just the extent of Africa's challenges that lie ahead. I use a single integrated forecasting platform hosted at the University of Denver for the forecast, so everything is interrelated. So eventually I am able to look at the impact of each of these transitions on matters like climate change, the impact of jobs and unemployment and all of these. So Eric, you're entirely right when you point to the challenges that lie ahead. There is no short-term, no magic bullet for Africa. Trade integration, leapfrogging, two areas that I also investigate in the book, for example, are hugely important and also the most impactful over time to change Africa's development trajectory. But it's a long road ahead. By 2030, which is the Sustainable Development Goal for eliminating extreme poverty, actually more Africans are going to be below $1.90 than is currently the situation, partly because of the rapid growth of Africa's population. And this only after about 2035 onwards do the numbers of extremely poor Africans, absolute numbers, not the percentage, start coming down. So the challenges that the continent face are deep and structural. There is no immediate and short-term easy solution. And something like COVID-19 gives Africa a huge blow, as will climate change, as will global instability and the trade wars between China and the United States and so on. But all of these transitions collectively could set Africa on a different growth path that eventually, in the second half of the century, we may see the growing gap between Africa and the rest of the world starting to close.
Speaking about the tension between the US and China at the moment, the crisis seems to be only ratcheting that tension upwards, and we're seeing a lot of quite kind of combative messages coming from both sides. How do you see that developing, and like where do you see Africa in between those two powers after the crisis? From my side, the crisis at the moment seems to be pushing Africa in the Chinese direction, just in terms of, because China is flying out aid and kind of help and masks and ventilators and so on to Africa. Even as the US seems to be increasingly really only focusing, on the domestic crisis, which is understandable. Kind of where do you see Africa in relation to the US and China going into the future, and and particularly also in relation to trade problems between the two?
I think that exactly what you are describing is what is happening. China is gaining ground. And the US is certainly slipping off the radar in Africa. But the US is embarked on its own future. Globally, the gravitas is shifting towards Asia as an integrated region, and Africa will increasingly, I think, look towards Asia for its future. As I've indicated, even after the China growth story slowly declines from very high levels, the next one is India and Asia as a whole. So that's certainly where Africa is going to look for its economic growth and opportunity. This doesn't mean that Europe and North America isn't important. It's just simply that the opportunities for the future certainly lie towards the east. What of course we don't need in Africa is another kind of Cold War. What we are looking for is collaboration and support, investment from the entire rest of the world. And that's where I think that the dynamics are different. This is, although I referred to the Cold War, I do think that there is a potential for partnerships in Africa. And what Africans, I think, are working on very hard is not to be pigeonholed into having to take sides in this global campaign. We need Chinese investment, because only China is going to and is building and has the potential to build the infrastructure in Africa. They have got surplus capacity. They had surplus capital. American and North European quality standards and project management is very important. We need all of this, and I think that many African leaders, hopefully, are not falling into the issue of that they have to make a choice. In actual fact, I would in any case make the argument that Africa is democratizing more rapidly than one would expect, given its levels of GDP and education. And in actual fact, you can use any measure of democracy, and there are about 3 or 4 out there that look at longitudinal measures of the extent of democracy. And if you compare the levels of democracy in Africa, given its levels of development, Africa is remarkably democratic. African people have experienced authoritarian rule over decades, and they do not look towards the Chinese model of governance. They look towards the West in terms of a variety, pop culture, language, and so on and so forth. But their leadership looks towards China as a model for development. But that model can only be applied in a handful of African countries. It is not widely possible or applicable across much of Africa. Africa will, in a sense, follow the development trajectory of India more than it will of China. That is, from the bottom upward, a little bit chaotic, quite corrupt, largely relying on services, which is a slow development pathway, rather than on manufacturing, because in a sense the manufacturing opportunity has partly been closed off, but also we don't have the skilled and other manpower. And services is increasingly expanding across Africa, and that is a slow growth pathway. So when we speak of Africa rising, and of course we all want that to happen, it's really a long-term prospect. It differs from country to country, and we all know Africa is not a single country, and complex and different. But the opportunities are there, but it's really in the long term.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa Channel Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa, or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
So your book takes us on a trajectory for the next 20 years to 2040. And I like to think about that time quite a bit, in part because that's the trajectory of the rest of my life as well, and I'm interested in that. But I also think about my son and the world that he's going into as well. And I see a couple key trends that seem like they're going to hit in that time space. So you mentioned very briefly the fourth industrial revolution. And for those who are not familiar, this is the emergence of 5G, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things. This is all of that automation that's coming. That is very exciting, but it's also equally terrifying, because the conservative estimates have that between 25 and 35% of all the current jobs that we have today will disappear. The more ambitious estimates put that up to 50 and 60%. Now, new jobs will be replaced, or maybe not in anywhere near the volume. The other issue is, of course, climate change that Cobus mentioned, and also we talk about quite a bit. It feels like Africa is going to hit that much harder than other parts of the world, as your own country literally almost ran out of water a couple of years ago. And it's getting hotter, and its weather is becoming more turbulent. Viruses are connected to climate change as well, as people consume animals that normally they didn't. And then the last one is this demographic dividend, and this is where my question comes for you. A lot of people look at Africa's demographic dividend as an exciting, great thing, that it's a continent of young people, which is wonderful, but it's a continent that is fast growing. And we're talking about a massive number of people that are going to need to be fed and employed. And I guess when you combine all three of these things, climate change, fourth industrial revolution, and the demographic dividend, I mean, I feel very negative about the future. I don't know. I'm scared. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of things weighing down on Africa's future. How do you think those three things will come together to play out over the next 20 years in your forecast, as you wrote out in the book?
You know, the best answer to that is a simple answer, and that is, ask your son if he would have preferred to live 10 years, 20 years earlier, or 10 or 20 years into the future. And I think young people generally always experience the reality different to us. Things are improving in Africa, and they are improving quite rapidly from low levels, and it's uneven from country to country. But we've all heard the story about the destruction of jobs with every previous of the three so-called industrial revolutions. Every industrial revolution has created more jobs than it has destroyed, and I think that will again be the case. On the one side, our problem is that it's very difficult for us to imagine a future that has got different jobs. So I spend a whole chapter in Africa First looking at the future of jobs and work. And I come to the conclusion that, yes, Africa already has a huge unemployment challenge, and many people survive and exist in the informal economy. And this is a survivalist economy in the way that it is in Africa. So people survive there, but of course the future, and also from a developmental perspective, is to bring the informal sector into the formal sector for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. But exactly the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution, where everybody has a cell phone, financial transactions are being done electronically, allows the more rapid formalization of the informal economy. Because you can bring large sectors of the informal economy into the formal economy at in a very marginal way. And I spent a lot of time in the book modeling this and looking at what that impact would be. One of the case studies is looking at the impact of this in Ghana. And this has a very rapid impact upon changes in productivity and of course, on state capacity, because states require tax revenues to be able to provide health and water and sanitation and education to their people. So Africa will struggle with a huge jobs challenge going forward, and therefore one of the scenarios that I model in the book is the requirement for the ongoing extension of cash schemes, the provision of cash grants, which South Africa 18 million South Africans are on cash grants. It's the most effective way of alleviating extreme poverty and dealing with inequality in the short, medium term. But over long time horizons, it has a negative impact on growth. But certainly, we will have to find innovative, alternative ways of providing jobs and work in Africa, even as the fourth industrial revolution probably unlocks more job opportunities that we may think exist. The second issue that you raise is the issue of the demographic dividend. This is hugely controversial, of course, but let's first define what it is. The demographic dividend is the relationship of working age people, typically 15 to 64, to dependents, children and the elderly. When that relationship is increasing, the relationship of working age people to dependents, economies grow. And this factor is very often underestimated in the contribution that it made to the growth of the Asian tigers, China, and many other countries, including the US and Europe, by the way, over long time horizons. What Africa has is a large population with a very large dependent, largely children dependence. And what happens with Africa's very youthful population, median age just below 20, is that we cannot build schools fast enough. We cannot roll out water sanitation rapidly enough to the existing people, never mind the new ones that are coming in. And that relationship, Africa needs to do two things. It needs to advance the demographic dividend. It needs to get to a relationship of about 1.7 working age persons to dependents, but it only gets there by about just after 2050. So what I'm saying is only 30 years from today does Africa actually enter a demographic sweet spot. By that time, the contribution that labor makes to growth has changed, and capital and technology are by far larger contributors to growth by that point. Because Africa's, the thing that everybody says that Africa has, it has a large population. A large population does not translate into more income per person. It means your economy may be growing, but it doesn't translate into improved livelihoods. To change livelihoods, you need to change the relationship, the contribution that labor makes to growth, that capital makes to growth, and that technology makes to growth. And the only thing that Africa has at the moment is labor. And our labor pool is generally in poor health and uneducated. So we need to bring the demographic dividend forward, enter it maybe not by 2054, which is the current forecast when we think Africa enters its demographic sweet spot, maybe 10 or 15 years earlier. And it must increase the ratio of working age people to dependents. Give you an example. China and the Asian tigers peaked at a ratio of 2.8 working age people to dependents. Africa will peak at about 2.1. India will peak at about 2.2. That means that your growth potential is much lower because the ratio of working age people to dependents is much lower. And we only get there, Africa only gets to that 2.1 to 2.1% ratio of working age people to dependents by about 2070. By that point, to repeat myself, the contribution that labor makes to economic growth has changed fundamentally because of the way the fourth industrial revolution is panning out. So that's the second issue that you mentioned, demographics. Hugely important, underestimated. Africa is a young population. That young population actually is a drag on growth, income growth. The third issue you mentioned, climate change. So in the book, I model 11 scenarios on what the contribution was of getting to Africa's demographic dividend, improving its manufacturing, trade integration, and so on. And I model the impact that has on carbon emissions. And of course, Africa at the moment contributes something like 4% of global carbon emissions. Even under the combined scenario, in the final chapter of the book, I put all these 11 scenarios together and I say, so if all comes together, what is the potential that Africa can have? Then Africa gets to about 8% of global carbon emissions. Of course, that is too much. Of course, we all need to change the impact of carbon emissions on the African economy, but on the global economy. But the main impact for Africa as a result of climate change is, of course, we have, largely because we have very limited infrastructure, we have very limited ability to cope with the impact of climate change. We don't have water and sanitation for poor people that can allow them to survive from day to day and escape the harsh impacts. So that climate change, beyond our contribution to global emissions, presents a huge challenge to the continent. For example, in the Sahel, we've done a big study on the future of the G5 Sahel countries. It already has a huge constraining impact on the ability, for example, in that region to expand agriculture, which is mostly a bit of herding, there's a bit of farming, but mostly it's grazing that people are dependent upon. So all these challenges come together, and we face problems not only in the nature of the transition of the global economy, but certainly in terms of the impact that the climate is going to have. So to go back to you ask about jobs, climate change, the demographic dividend. These are all transitions that Africa has to undergo if it wants to start closing the gap between the averages in for example, in income between itself and in the rest of the world.
You mentioned that Africa is going through democratization. You know that African societies are becoming more democratic. At the same time, obviously, as you mentioned, African societies are also very young, and African leaders tend to be on the old side. And there is a kind of a vacuum in innovative leadership frequently in Africa, particularly in terms of planning economic diversification. How do you see that trend developing? Like, will increased democratization in Africa mean that there'll be younger, more innovative, more technocratic leaders actually pushing some of these agendas? Or what am I leaving out in that calculus?
I think the question you're really asking is, what is the relationship between democracy and growth? And at low levels of development, there is no real relationship. When you are a high-income economy, like the US and so on and so forth, a competitive political system, a competitive economic system requires a competitive political system. Africa is a long way from that. At low levels of development, and there's quite a lot of academic literature on this, democracy may in actual fact be a drag on growth. This is not, we don't like saying this, but that's just simply the reality. What is much more important for economic growth is the orientation of the governing elite. If you have a governing elite, like you have in Ethiopia and Rwanda, that is committed to growth and development and absolutely says in these two countries, we will never again allow the kind of trauma that our countries experienced with the Rwandan genocide and the Red Terror in Ethiopia, then countries grow. But as you point out, what we have particularly in Southern Africa is we have elderly liberation era leadership that are trapped in the past. They hanker back to the Soviet Union and Cuba as examples of growth. Whereas we all know that the future, government is very important at low levels of development, but as countries go from low to middle to upper to high level of income, the private sector eventually becomes the engine of growth. We see that even in China, we see that across the world. And that requires a very different orientation towards the structure and how economies grow. Foreign direct investment becomes important. Being much more nimble and agile in today's economic environment. That requires a younger, future-orientated leadership. And that we don't yet see. We see in the developed world, we see young leaders emerging, whether that is from Austria to France to Canada. But in Africa, we are trapped in old leadership that really does not really provide for the future. There are exceptions. And those countries, I think, are doing much better than the rest of us. But over time, democracy and the accountability function that it brings with it, hopefully will also bring that younger leadership to play in Africa. But that's not so. I go back to the orientation of the governing elite, particularly at low levels of development, is much more important than the institutional setting, democratic or authoritarian. Democracy becomes important, and it is, of course, desirable from a variety of perspectives. And Africans want democracy. They've had it with authoritarian leadership. They've experienced that. But that does not necessarily translate automatically into better economic outcomes.
Let's close our discussion today by having you take us right to the end of the book. In your conclusion, tell us a little bit about, without giving away the ending, because we want people to buy the book, but at the end of the day, tell us what your conclusions are from looking at the next 20 years. What should we be looking for?
You know, I'm speaking, Eric, as if Africa is a country. Of course, it's not. I generally use the World Bank low, middle, upper middle income classifications to look at different categories, and the modeling is done at, you can look at the impact on individual African countries. So, for example, there are 11 scenarios in the book, ranging from the demographic dividend to agriculture and the impact of climate change. So in the final conclusion, in the concluding chapter, I compare the impact of these different scenarios, one upon the other, and I look at what is the impact of a combined Africa First scenario on the future growth of Africa. So, of course, depending on every individual country is different. But, for example, low-income countries, as we would expect, agriculture is generally provides the best return in terms of reducing levels of poverty, of increasing incomes, and so on. But that is followed by leapfrogging and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And leapfrogging and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes more important for middle income and upper middle income countries. South Africa, for example, will probably benefit the most from the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area because we trade with more countries. We will simply benefit and experience the increased bump that you get from more trade, particularly more added value trade into the rest of Africa. So the book looks at comparing the impact on countries, but also on groups of countries using the World Bank income classifications, and then looks at what is possible. And I think what Africa First tells us, again, things are improving in Africa, but it's a long road ahead, and it's going to require a combination of basic things. You know, there is often a desire to find some kind of a magic bullet to solve a particular problem. Africa will grow if we get the fundamentals in place. And the fundamentals are making sure that our populations are fed and healthy, that they are literate, that they are educated, that they have access to basic infrastructure, and that the governing party or leadership provides that. That it does not, for example, try to leapfrog into building expensive infrastructure and create infrastructure nodes that the rest of the country that cannot link into the economy. I'll give you an example. Mozambique is going to be the destination, as you guys have talked about, as one of the largest foreign direct investments in gas in the northern part of Mozambique it's going to be the largest investment in Africa's recent history, more than foreign direct investment, total aid to Africa. But the question is, what benefit will that investment in gas have on the average incomes of Mozambicans? Our analysis shows very little. Most of that will leave Mozambique. It will come to a very small group of leadership and so on and so forth. To fix Mozambique is an extremely poor country. You need to fix the basics. And so I think that I conclude the book by reference to what I refer to as the standard growth model. And that is that Africa needs to look at how other countries, South Korea and others, developed. They did not develop through commodities or through some magic or through aid. They developed by a governing elite that looks after the basics. Development is about independence. Development is not about dependence. Development is about helping yourself and looking after making local communities become independent of handouts and of development aid and it is taking ownership of your own future at every level of society. That is the history and the success of South Korea, for example. It is also what Africa needs to do. There is no magic solution. There are basics that need to be put in place. And eventually, if we put all these basics together and we do sequence them in the right way, Africa has the potential to start closing the gap with the averages in the rest of the world.
Well, the book is Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. It's brand new, just came out in February. Unlike the academic books that we feature on this program, this one is actually affordable. $10 is all you need to get a Kindle version of it. And as we're all sheltering unable to go outside, this is the perfect thing to do to actually occupy some of the endless hours that we're stuck inside. So congratulations on the book. I'm about halfway through it. I'm very, very excited to get through the other half after speaking with you. And you've given me a little bit more optimism about the future, despite the fact that we are in the midst of this horrific nightmare that seems like it's derailing many of the trends that you've touched on. But at the same time, as long as there is some hope, I remain very, very happy to hear that from you. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'd love to kind of follow up with you in a few months as we see how the effects of the COVID-19 economic impact will unfold in Africa.
Thank you very much, Eric and Corbus, and thanks for the interview. The book is available on Amazon and only came out about 2 weeks ago. I was fortunate to get a nice quote from President Ramaphosa and the President of Ethiopia and the head of the NEPAD, Africa Development Agency, Dr. Mayaki. So the book is available on Amazon and also on my website, which is www.jakkiecilliers.org. The Jakkie is a nickname. It's Jakkie. Yes, I'm very interested in the reaction. I don't think anything like this has been done before, where you use a single integrated platform to do these kind of long-term forecasts on the future of Africa. Corbus, thank you very much. Eric, thanks very much. And I continue listening to your podcast, which is well done.
Corbus, I don't really know what to think right now because it's hard to have a hopeful outlook. And Jakkie certainly has a hopeful outlook. And that's good. I think we need that hope right now because it feels really dark. And I think it's easy to get sucked into that darkness. But so much of what he's talking about that happens over the next 20 years depends on multilateral institutions remaining intact. It depends on climate change not devastating vast portions of the African economy. There's a lot of X factors and variables that we are learning today with COVID-19, how fragile the system is and how quickly things can turn. Now, that being said, we can only worry about the negatives and then positives start to emerge as well. So he talked about the fourth industrial revolution, which certainly is going to benefit Africa in many ways. I'm not as hopeful on the manufacturing side. I think Southeast Asia is still going to be a more attractive investment for that. But again, there's a lot of variables here. And so I'm confused right now.
Yeah, I think being confused is probably a natural state right at the moment. You know, everything is so scrambled and so up in the air. Like I find his analysis very comforting in the sense that, I mean, not necessarily because he's so optimistic, because I think in lots of ways he's quite realistic. He tends to, I think a lot of his work includes kind of tamping down the kind of overly optimistic kind of Africa rising narratives.
Yeah, it's not the typical Africa rising narrative.
Yeah, he's
not
like,
at all,
this is going to take decades, settle in, kind of, but it does provide a kind of a slowly moving forward kind of trajectory of what development could actually look like in a lot of different sectors, which I find quite comforting. I guess the question is, it's very easy to see the current crisis as this kind of massive cliff in front of us. Whereas as we look at, at the global economic crisis of 2008, that was itself a massive cliff. And you still see that cliff reflected in graphs on a lot of different kind of historical analyses. But at the same time, people emerged after the economic crisis, kind of the economy kind of moved on after it. So it's not, it might be overly gloomy to think that every single thing will change. The question is more, a bunch of them will change, a bunch of them won't, and which is which. That's the difficult thing.
To a point, but at the same time, a lot of people who lost big in the 2008 economic crisis, particularly, say, in my country, in the United States, African Americans never recovered those gains. So they were in the housing market, and then they were pushed out, and they never got back into it. The wealth inequity, the gap between the rich and poor, has only continued to widen, and I think globally that will also be the case as well. And then again, we have to not think about Africa as a single entity, in part because different pockets of the continent are going to behave differently. But so the two factors that I'm going to look at is how long does this crisis go on right now that we're in the middle of? Because if this is over in a couple months, then I think you're right, we can recover. But if this thing goes on for a year and doesn't take us into a recession like we had in 2008, but takes us into a depression, which is what people are now forecasting, which is a severity of a recession that is just unimaginable, 1929 level, then all bets are off for the future. It could be a whole generation before recovery happens. And that's not meant to be alarmist. That's just meant to kind of broaden the scope and impact of the damage that's being done here. And then we have, again, the sustainability of China's interest in Africa. And there are some indications that China is losing a lot of interest in Africa and in South America as well. China is going to turn inwards in many ways, and it's going to focus on itself. And I don't know where the money comes from to fund the types of things that Africa needs without the Chinese. Huawei was only able to do what it did in Africa because it had state-backed loans. If those loans are not available there, what happens? That fourth industrial revolution doesn't happen. That's the big part I don't understand, because the Americans and the Europeans, they're not stepping up. They're not going to step up. They're going to lecture and they're going to talk and they're going to preach, but they're not going to put cash on the table. Maybe for some legacy health programs like PEPFAR will continue, but not new big things, I don't think. And the International Development Finance Corporation that the U.S. keeps talking about, that is small potatoes compared to what Africa actually needs. So that's not going to move the needle. So again, I'm a little bit skeptical. Let me just say that Jackie's book is so accessible. It is, a lot of the think tank books in your circle, Cobus, are very academic, lots of technical language in it, lots of high prose. This thing is really readable. And again, for $10 on a Kindle, it's accessible. And I think they priced it appropriately for a mass audience. He's writing this for a mass audience, so I can't recommend it enough. Okay, Cobus, I'll give you the last word, since I went on a little bit longer there, about where do you think we are right now in this moment fighting COVID-19 as you are about to embark on a lockdown in South Africa as they try and strangle this thing, and kind of juxtapose that with what you've heard from Jackie in the next 20 years?
Yep, it's a difficult thing to answer. At the moment, everything is very unsure. The one thing I have to say that is probably an upside is that in South Africa, particularly, I think the government has acted in a much more concerted way and showing a lot more leadership than a lot of people had feared. So South Africa had come out of a leadership vacuum of almost a decade under Jacob Zuma. Where in lots of ways, somewhat similar to what some people characterize as one, under the crisis in the US at the moment, in the sense that there was a strong sense of elites looking out for themselves rather than for the whole country. Now the comprehensiveness of the lockdown is in a way encouraging, because it does show that there is a plan. And I think that is some African populations are looking for that kind of leadership. Whether that kind of leadership will actually benefit, that's the question. And then also whether it'll be possible to inject the kind of development reforms that Jackie has been calling for is another question. Who will pay for that is the third question. All of those are up in the air at the moment. I think, while it's really important to look forward, but it's also important to acknowledge how we're kind of in the middle of a fog. We only see 2 meters in front of us at the moment, and everyone has to kind of keep moving forward. I think Africa. One of the things that this one of the larger things that might come out of all of this is for Africa to start really thinking of itself in terms of its own set of agendas, even if those if there aren't funds in place to bring them forward, rather than how it fits into larger international players' agendas. Africa is so used to kind of trying to strategize around which part of its population or mineral wealth or whichever other part of its endowment is useful to outside players, China needs commodities, so let's sell commodities to China. There seems to be some kind of aid money coming out of Europe at the moment, let's kind of rearrange things to maximize trying to take advantage of that. the alternative is really an African agenda for African development. And if this kind of puts, if the kind of fallout of this massive crisis is that Africa is able to think of itself in terms of its own priorities, maybe because a whole lot of external actors have fallen away, that's not great, but at the same time, that's also not the worst thing. But all of this is just prognostication. So difficult to predict at the moment.
It is speculation. It is very, very difficult. But in order to understand the 20-year viewpoint, you have to understand the day-to-day, and that is getting more difficult because there are so many different sources of information, so much conflicting data out there. And one of the things that Cobus and I are trying to do with our daily newsletter is to filter that out. And it's the reason why people at the UN, the State Department, the World Bank, you name it, the think tanks in DC, a number of them are all subscribing to this thing because it helps them figure out the day-to-day. So we're really chronicling what's going on. And we're trying to be able to throw you, with this newsletter, one very provocative idea. You may not agree with it every day, but it's just designed to get you to think. So if you're in a meeting, you're talking to somebody, you can have this idea. And then we also chronicle the rest of the day's news on Twitter, on all the different social media platforms. What are the different memes? What are different thought leaders saying? We'd love for you to try it out. You get 2 weeks for free. A lot of journalists are subscribing to it. We're really happy with how the community is growing, and we would love for you, our podcast listeners, to also be a part of this community. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. If you're interested in anything that we do, subscribing or being able to follow what we're doing, just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com. Also, if you want to email Cobus or I, you can find me at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com and Cobus at COBUS@ChinaAfricaProject.com. Okay, so we'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at @eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.